Hello and welcome to the Frontington and Backwoods Railway. With the build of the railway itself coming along nicely, I thought it was time to start a side project. No, the other side. That's it. That's the Hornby Smokey Joe I had as a kid. But the question I'm sure we're all asking is, how would it look in Great Western Green? Okay, some explanation is needed here because I'm pretty sure no one has ever thought that. What I'm planning on doing for this project is to reimagine this little saddle tank locomotive in Great Western livery and fit a DCC chip in it so that it can pootle around my goods yard. I shared this Photoshop mock-up in a Facebook group recently, and the responses ranged from "here are 101 other things you should do to make it prototypical," to "that's a stupid idea, do something else instead." Thankfully, most people were somewhere in the middle and generally supportive. Now, the first elephant in the room is that my Smokey Joe probably doesn't look like your Smokey Joe. And that's because I've already spent some time fiddling with it, back when I ran it on my old Frontington layout, which was DC. Cosmetically, I decided I didn't want the comical Smokey Joe text in bright white letters on the side, so I painted over that in black. It was also my first attempt at detailing and weathering, with mixed results. I applied rust streaks using a brown pencil crayon, which worked surprisingly well. The cab was picked out too, which looks reasonable, but not being based on anything, I've no idea how accurate it is. And I tried painting the connecting rods to take the shine off them, and they look pretty awful. And slightly more drastic was that I added some handrails to the sides, although the wire I used was far too flimsy. And then there's the tender. And believe it or not, many of these locomotives in the real world ended up with these makeshift tenders, built from old wagons, and that gave these little tank engines a little more range. This tender started life as an old Hornby 5-plank wagon, which I've added extra pickups to so that the little 040 has a bit more chance of getting over Insel Frog points and dirty track. It worked pretty well, actually. But before we go any further, it's worth explaining why I'm doing this at all. This is a Caledonian locomotive, after all, so it would have spent most of its life in Scotland. Now, my geography's not great, but even I know that that's nowhere near South Devon, which is where my layout is set. No Caledonian Class 264 was ever owned by the Great Western Railway. So let me explain my thinking. My model railway depicts Frontington, a branch line terminus in the countryside, and just up the line is Backwoods Halt. Neither of these places actually exist. It's fictional. It's not a copy of anywhere at all. There are no prototypes I'm working from. But that's okay. What I'm aiming for isn't something that's prototypical, but rather something that's plausible. Important word that, I use it a lot. What I mean by plausible is that I can construct a story around it that's believable. That means there's some artistic license at play here. There are limits, of course. You won't find aliens parked in the car park. It's set in the late 1930s, so you won't find an HST pulling into the station. Thank you. So, here's the story I'm telling for my Great Western Smokey Joe. Now, we know that the Caledonian Railway built 34 of these little tank engines between 1885 and 1908, primarily for use as shunters in the Glasgow area. That's completely factual, by the way, taken straight from Wikipedia. We also know that down in Wales there were many coal mines in operation that needed small industrial locomotives. That's also true. So let's imagine that one of these companies decided that instead of building their own, they would use an existing Class 264. Maybe someone knew a bloke who had a friend whose second cousin's hairdresser once met a chap in the pub who had a Class 264 going spare. And after a little wrangling, let's say that one of these Scottish locomotives ends up working in Wales. Now, back to reality, and we also know that the 1921 Railways Act meant that the majority of these little railway companies across the country were grouped together into 4 main operators. The Great Western Railway inherited a whole load of Welsh locomotives during grouping. Some were immediately scrapped and replaced with something better. Others were Swindonised beyond recognition, while a few lucky survivors were just given a new paint job. Look at real-life locomotives like the 813 or Trojan, both of which survived into preservation. So let's use our imaginations again and suggest that our particular little Class 264 was adopted by the Great Western Railway because it happened to be in Wales at that point. Let's say that it was in pretty good nick, but wasn't worth a complete overhaul. And when the Frontington branch line requested a small shunting locomotive, the Great Western powers that be decided that they could have the strange Scottish locomotive, as it was out of the way and no one would notice. So it was given a splash of green and sent on its way. Plausible? Just about. Certainly convoluted. But it's just enough to allow me to keep my beloved childhood Smokey Joe. And after all, it was significant enough to be made part of the Frontington logo, so it would be nice to keep it around. My first job is to make sure it's actually going to physically work, which means I need to make it digital. Removing the body is just a case of gently pulling up on it. I say gently because the plastic lugs keeping it in place are rather worn by now. But there are no screws, and it's snug enough not to be wobbly. And now we can see inside. In particular here you can see the extra pickup wires from the tender. It seems that one's disconnected itself already, which is helpful of it. You might also notice that the motor is upside down. That was one of the modifications I made when I added the tender. Normally, the motor just sits on top of the contacts, which didn't seem very reliable, so I soldered a couple of wires in place instead. And that actually helped me enormously, because it'll make installing the DCC chip easier. I'm just going to disconnect the other wire so I can remove the tender, as that's just going to get in the way. You can see here how I made it, using some little brass strips that make contact with the tops of the wheels. This is the DCC chip I'm putting in. It's a cheap Lay's DCC chip that I bought some time ago, and was originally installed in my 5600 class. But that loco is far too big for this layout, so I've taken the chip out and retired the model. And since the chip was so cheap and nasty, I don't mind hacking it about. The plan is to locate it over the motor here. So now I'm going to disconnect everything else from the motor. We don't need the capacitor, because the DCC chip should include one of those already. I do need to clean up that big blob of leftover solder though. Nope, that's made it worse. Where's my solder sucker? I'm sure it was around here somewhere. Here we go. Now all I need to do is heat up the solder and suck it up. Yes, much better. Now back to the DCC chip. I don't need all of these wires, I only need the orange and grey wires to go to the motor and the red and black for the pickups. I'm not going to use the socket, so that can go. and now I can more easily get at the wires I need. The orange and grey wires only need to be around 3 centimetres long in this case, so I'll trim those to size, with a bit of wiggle room in case I make any mistakes. The red and black ones can be a little longer. But the others can be trimmed back, though not all the way. I'm leaving a little behind in case I ever need them in future. And to keep them out of the way, I'll fold them back over the chip and secure them in place with some electrical tape. Much tidier. Next, I can trim and tin the wires, ready for soldering. Orange and grey go to the motor. It doesn't really matter which way round these go, because you can switch it round in the CV values later if it happens to be backwards. And the same goes for the pickup wires actually. The chip doesn't really care which is positive and negative, it'll sort itself out. The first test is putting it on my programming track. Power on and, well, there's no smoke, that's usually a good sign. And JMRI can detect the chip and read its settings, so it looks like that's all successful. So here it is on the track. Let's see what happens. Okay, I probably should have cleaned the wheels before I tried this. But with a little persuasion, it's clear that the chip is getting power and receiving instructions and sending power to the motor, so from a DCC install point of view, I'd call that a success. But before we call the job done, let's do a quick bit of tidying up. First, those solder joints need to be covered up to stop them shorting. I probably should have used some heat shrink on them, but I don't have any in the right size at the moment, so electrical tape it is. I also need to secure the chip in place, and for now I'm just going to use a blob of blue tack. And then the body can slot over the top. With a little running in and TLC, this is starting to look pretty positive. I mean, it's not perfect, of course. I haven't changed the physical gearing, so it'll still do 250 miles an hour if you give it a chance. And, as I expected, the reliability hasn't really improved much. It's still fundamentally a cheap Hornby 040 from 30 years ago. But that's why I mounted the chip over the motor. I've deliberately left plenty of space in front of that for a stay-alive capacitor. I don't think this particular Lay's DCC chip supports Stay Alive, but at least I know that there's room for one. For now, I can see that it works in principle, and one day I'll come back and install a better chip and a Stay Alive. In the meantime, I can press on with giving it a Great Western livery, knowing that it does have some potential. I'm going to leave this video here, I think. If you like where this is heading, hit that like button, and subscribe if you want to see the next video when that comes out. If you want to help me buy a DCC chip and stay alive, there's a little link in the description where you can send me a small donation. Thanks for watching, bye for now.